Thanks very much for all joining us. We've got such a fantastic turnout today. And I think that is due to the quality of the panel of people that we have got with us today. I'm Sharon Constanson. My role in the livery company, other than to make sure I keep the rest of my court in order, I think they teach me more than I've ever learned in this environment. It's quite a fascinating place to come into as a newbie, as I have done. And as chairman of the membership committee, one of our activities is to ensure that we engage our members and to make ourselves relevant to potential members for the livery company. So we spend a good amount of time engaging, unfortunately in this sort of, feels like a stained glass window style environment instead of in the real world, which is a little unfortunate, but as we all know, we have to live in our stained glass box and not allowed to go and enjoy wine with each other. But that hopefully is something that will change in the second half of the year. And we will be able to do some of these events where we can enjoy a decent glass of wine over a decent conversation, because it is difficult to network as well as you can in a face-to-face environment. So just to introduce our panelists for now, Angela, if I could also ask you to wave your hand, because then people will see you. Angela started a career in engineering, then went into politics and the Minister of Parliament, and then she moved into business and into the financial services sector, and decided to join it at the time, or had certain key association roles at the time that the credit crunch came. So she's seen some interesting times and now has very much a busy plural career, knows a lot of people, is very well connected, and is chairman SID, non-exec, and chairman of committees as well as, so her role is an extremely busy one. You can all read up more on her later or jump onto LinkedIn, you can see plenty more. Maddie, who's with us as well. Maddie, do you want to shake your hand about somewhere? There you are, right next to Angela on my screen. You're ideal, right next to each other. Maddie has spent the time at EY, and then she moved to HSBC, which is where she'll be giving us some of the stories of her last year as head of board governance for HSBC Group. So quite an interesting time I'm sure she has had during this recent period. Paul, who hasn't quite joined us yet, I don't think. Paul Hardy is barrister, ex-House of Lords, has now gone to DLA Piper and is their Brexit director, and has spent a lot of time working with organizations through the COVID/Brexit transition over the last year. So should be able to give us some good insights. Right, what we're going to do, format of tonight, please, health and safety rules. To make sure your question is aired and voiced and discussed, please drop it in the chat line at any point during the conversation so that we can monitor it, and I will pose the questions, combine questions, make sure that they're relevant questions. And then once we get to an hour from now, when we've had the last 20 minutes of formal Q&A, we will open it to conversation. And if any of our panelists are able to stay with us, they will. If not, we will have a more informal networking conversation that will follow. I'm going to start, Maddie, with you, if I may. There's no presentations. This is just general conversation for them to share their insights, case studies, learnings of the period we've been through. So we're going to learn good lessons, learn what were bad lessons, and work out what are we going to take forward into 2021 as organizations and as individuals. So I'm going to be covering it from both perspectives, not ignoring the fact that some people are actually human beings in this process and have had to deal with some of these challenges as well. So if you look, Maddie, at some of the biggest challenges HSBC and you and the board had to deal with in 2020, in terms of the fact we are now a stained glass window, everybody's flat, you can't watch what their hands are doing, you don't know who's secretly texting somebody else at the same time, you don't know if they're distracted. And most importantly is, how did it work for ordinary board processes? And how has it worked for the more difficult conversations, either something, for example, of a strategic nature, or something that's about risk, or something that is the one topic we don't always want to talk about easily, How has your board handled it, or HSBC's board handled some of those kind of challenges?
You're right. It's been a pretty crazy year. There's, I think that the biggest thing we had to manage was just the increased volume of meetings that we needed to have. There was obviously so much more to talk about, and the landscape was changing so quickly throughout the year that actually we need to make sure that the board was talking to each other much more regularly. So certainly from a COSEC perspective, there was a lot, just physically a lot more work to manage. I felt like the sort of nature of virtual discussions, some really worked. You know, I'm sure a lot of you will have found this. You know, if it's something very technical, quite straightforward, that actually worked better on Zoom for us, because you could use the technology to good effect. The chairman could very well manage the room and line people up to, you know, talk in turn. There was no one talking over each other. You could put use the yes/no function to make decisions quickly. That really worked. What we did find really challenging, and it was something we were discussing throughout the whole year, was I suppose the less tangible strategic discussions, where in reality you want to create a bit of tension in the room. There's no problem with actually sometimes people getting a bit heated, maybe talking over each other, just to kind of really work out key issues. And it was very difficult to, I suppose, create that tension in the room. I think that's what was difficult.
Thanks, Maddie. And I thought that point you made about the strategic, difficult conversation, and actually it being productive sometimes to have those critical conversations where people can really engage instead of being polite in the space that we tend to find ourselves in now. And the chairman can't necessarily mute you as easily as he can do now, or she can do now. First, before I continue, I'd like to welcome Paul Hardy, who has joined us now. Paul, would you like to give us a wave from where you are down
there? Hi there all. I'm so sorry to be late.
No problem, Paul. We did allow for it because you had warned me. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us, Paul. I have already introduced you, so everyone knows who you are. And if we could all just stay on mute and stay with our pictures up wherever we can. And please put all questions into the chat that you would like us to cover towards the end of the conversation that we're going to be having. We'll give Paul a moment or two just to get used to the environment, and Angela will have a little conversation quickly now. One of the things I wanted to understand, because you're on a good number of boards in different industries that have different focal points, and you also have a network of an incredible number of people that you know as well, beyond just the boards, what sort of key themes have you picked up in the way people have responded, or companies have responded, or boards have responded to the challenges of everything that came at us last year? Are there any themes you can tease out for us?
Yes, I mean, there's some themes are exactly the ones that Maddie has raised, and that is that the fact that meetings tended to be more structured. Once we got used to it, we were all awful at the start, and then you got better and better on Zoom and Teams and all the rest of it as we moved on. The very fact that we got a good chairman, the meeting was more structured, was quite helpful in some decision making and quite unhelpful in some of the other decision making. But at the same time, even in those bits which you want to be together with which strategy is a key, but not the only one, we've also got better at it. So you can do, it's almost like, when you're first in front of cameras, you kind of are terribly conscious of the camera. And then after a bit, you just, start swearing like a trooper as normal. Well, it's been a bit the same with Zoom. We started off being all terribly good and polite and putting your makeup on and all the rest of it, as we've gone along. So we've actually got better at having a proper discussion, and one that isn't too rigid. But with the exception of one of my boards, we all took the opportunity in the middle of the summer, where things were more relaxed, to hire a barn or something like that. So the entire board got together on an away day. So or day and a half. So in fact, you know, we were socially distancing. You got to boom a bit, of course, but at the same time, actually getting back face to face was both beneficial on a personal basis, because I don't know what you're like, but oh dear, you know, you do get fed up with the screen, for heaven's sake. So it was nice actually to get back together. We even managed a drink as well, which was terribly good, yeah. But we got the discussion going in that additional and extra way, which you don't quite get, however good you're at it, you don't quite get out of Zoom. I think a couple of things, though, that, of course, I think are common to all companies. The first was that we realized just how much time we'd wasted actually, you know, getting on planes, going to meetings, commuting and all the rest, and how whatever the new normal is concerned, new normal turns out to be, it will not be the same as before. We will do more things virtually than we had got used to in the past, i.e. technology, the way that we deal with the tools at our disposal has sort of leapt 5 or 6 years forward in, you know, 6-8 months. So we all learned that. Second thing that we all learned as well is that the whole question of mental health is actually more important than one had realized. And it's not just, you know, people who've been having to work with the loo being the only place in their rather small flat where there was any peace away from the children. But of course, we'd all got a youthful generation who, you know, they were sort of 3 in a small flat, and all that was very, very difficult. Doesn't mean that it doesn't hit you in between as well, but the importance of mental health. And so keeping people together was very much about actually being positive and outreaching to those groups and those individuals where we thought there's a problem. And the third thing that we learned is that your risk register and your emergency backup was just a whole load of rubbish, frankly. You know, how many people are going to be shutting down, you know, their backup site in Canary Wharf or somewhere towards Birmingham? I mean, we're all going to be, because the whole idea that you up sticks, you know, 50, 100 people and you park them in your, you know, your warm or your cool or your tepid or whatever site, and so they all sort of logged on and got on with it, you know, is complete, you know, that's yesterday. We're not going to do it. We are going to do it from home or something, some variation. And just my last thing, if I may, is that whilst the whole frequency of meetings and the things that boards and all the way down the companies had to deal with COVID, you know, that has been incredible performance for many people. But you must not forget that you've also got to carry on developing the business, making the business fit for the future. You know, it just has got to be done as well. So your strategy is partly COVID survival, but if it's only COVID survival, you'll be behind the queue as matters get better. So there we go. There's a few thoughts.
Thanks, Angela. The one thing you brought to very much to mind for me is I've worked with a number of boards who've really, really struggled when people have been remote, stuck remote, on a business trip, at another board meeting, far away, can't make it, sick, whatever it is. And they've dialed in by telephone. Isn't that such an archaic thought now? And how inefficient it was for those individuals who were on the phone. I know I've chaired meetings where you forget the person's on the phone because they're not visible to you. And they get distracted, bored, and get on with whatever else they're doing. Suddenly you hear a noise from the middle of the table. You suddenly realize somebody else is actually in the room other than those that are present. So I think one of the things that we've lost, hopefully for good, is that dialing in by telephone and not actually being visibly part of the engagement so that we can address people more easily in that way. You did say something that leads me on to a question I'd like to ask of Paul Hardy. You were talking about ensuring that you're getting on with the day job of the company, still determining where the goals and the strategy and the vision are, of the organisation. Now, Paul, as the director for Brexit for DLA Piper, that is the getting on and getting things done so that they made everything achieved within their transition period. But at the same time, you had your customers dealing with the COVID crisis. Have you got some stories, learnings that you can share with us from that?
Yes, sure, Sharon. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all. Yes, I mean it's very interesting to kind of analyze the response of businesses in different sectors to crises. And one of the interesting things about being a Brexit advisor and actually being quite new to kind of the commercial world, having been a civil servant before that, so only in the last 4 years. So I come with kind of quite kind of fresh eyes to the world of commerce, is how businesses follow each other. And businesses in the same sector follow each other. And that's actually, I think, more true of some Asian clients than it is of European clients. But there is a kind of group mentality, and it takes one business to sort of break cover and to explain what it's doing. And I found that then that would become the received wisdom as to how to kind of how to prepare for Brexit. And what happened last year is, I mean, Brexit fatigue would be an understatement, wouldn't it? I mean, the negotiations dragged on. We were going to have a Brexit, then we weren't. It was going to be no deal, then it was going to be a deal, until it came to its final conclusion. And one of the real difficulties for companies was to kind of maintain sufficient interest in the Brexit risk register from board level down, and particularly with kind of Brexit task forces. And what happened last year was, for every client that certainly I worked for, Brexit just slipped down the agenda. The moment the transition period was signed and sealed by the end of January of last year, and you knew that there was an 11-month gap where everything was going to stay the same, Brexit was off the agenda through fatigue, but also because businesses needed to get on with other day-to-day matters. And then within 2 or 3 months of that, COVID-19 hit. And it completely displaced Brexit planning. So to give you an idea of the way the UK sector in particularly planned for Brexit, this last year, end of December, beginning of January last year, the Brexit work died down pretty much completely. The transition deal was done. COVID-19 brought in a lot of different kind of COVID-19 work that I was involved in as head of government affairs for DLA Piper as well. And then come September or October, then businesses started to dust down their Brexit planning. The boards began to inquire as to how prepared the business was to this kind of Brexit compared to the kind of Brexit they'd had to prepare for last year. And there was a sustained sort of acceleration in Brexit planning from, I'd say, October through to December. And that was pretty much the similar pattern last year. Businesses will react when they have to, and they will begin to focus and push an item up the agenda. When it becomes inevitable, it's months away and there's a hard deadline, then suddenly, minds focus on it again.
Thanks, Paul. And just to follow on a comment made by Angela to all of you in the chat, is that from a technology point of view, people will still be contacting into meetings via telephone when computer signals or whatever are not as available. But I don't think that will be the default to the extent it was as the option. Maddie, just coming back to you on looking at where HSBC was this time, or January to March last year. Was there a sense from some other experiences you've shared and understood with colleagues and other businesses you might have had some contact with? Was your board more mindful, because of its Asia footprint and involvement, of the pending crisis that was evolving at that point in time? Or were they much like the rest of the boards that were in the financial services sector that probably were much the same as Commerce, thinking it's not going to be that bad until suddenly it was?
I'd like to say the former, but actually it was the latter. It was interesting because in Hong Kong, where obviously we have a huge footprint there, there was such a different response to the way we managed it in Europe. You know, everything was locked down very quickly. People just immediately, you know, they'd gone through it before with SARS and other viruses. So there was much more of a, you know, a kind of already agreed response in Asia. And so, yes, the board were aware of it, and it was, you know, clearly, you know, on the agenda and something they were focused on. But it wasn't really until kind of March time, when it really kicked in Europe, that it was so much of a focus. So I'd like to say that we were much more aware of it because of our Asian footprint, but I think it was being kind of managed very differently and well in Asia. So it wasn't, you know, really recognized as the issue it was going to be at that stage.
Mm-hmm. No, interesting from that perspective. We had a presentation by a no longer now a FTSE company, but they used to be a FTSE company, where they had Asia, Europe, and US footprint, and how the three sectors of the globe responded so dramatically differently to the COVID crisis, and how this London central point of a governance committee trying to tie in the expectations, demands, and behaviors of these this global entity that was behaving like three completely different organizations. Which leads me to the point of view around risk, Angela, which I'd like to cover. Being in financial services, risk is something that you are familiar with. You're familiar with risk committees and focusing on emerging risks and actually thinking dynamically about risk, which we don't always see outside of financial services to the same extent. Now, I know one of your boards is not financial services, so you might be able to speak from both perspectives. Yes, we said a moment ago earlier, the risk register went out the window. We start to think things differently. What sort of risks did come up? You made reference to staff welfare. What specifically about staff, but what were all the other risks that literally you had to quickly step up and face in the various businesses?
And maybe I should say as well that one of my companies, as you rightly point out, Sharon, is a FTSE 100 house builder. So it's got a long way from financial services. But I am on a US financial services board, and there the difference of view was quite noticeable between the US and the UK. And as you know, I'm also the deputy chairman of the governing body of the new financial regulator in Kazakhstan. So, you know, I mean, boy, had you got some cultural issues here. So, you know, Kazakhstan, which is, yes, it's a democracy, but boy, do they, you know, it's not the democracy of the sort that we know. So the man says do and everybody does, you know, so there's a complete instantaneous vanish to home. And whatever risks you might have, oh, you just had to get them sorted out, you know. So the idea that we went through a risk register in the way that and looked at our strategic risks in the way that we would do on other boards wasn't really there, because that becomes unacceptable in that sort of environment to say, but hang on, I've got a risk here. It's do, and you do it now, and you just do it. So that was very much at one end of the sort of reactions to it. The other end, well, not really to that extent, but the US certainly reacted culturally very differently. And this isn't a Trump issue at all. It's just that in the US, the economic issues stood much higher up in the balance between the economic issues and the health issues than they did in the UK. So in effect, in the UK, we did, once we grasped it being that COVID-19 wasn't just, you know, man flu by another name, pardon me saying that, you know, it was something major and something different and something much more serious. We really did health first, and the US did the economy first. And as we started to balance out here, health and the economic balance, we still came to a stage where health, you know, was up here, whereas in the US, the economy was considered to be not necessarily a higher priority, but much more on a par. So that then, of course, flows down to the risks that you're assessing. I think that with the house builders, what they did is they all closed all sites for a month, and then they all reopened just about all sites because you could, because you're doing it outside, you know, and you already have quite a lot of protective gear anyway. But with the house builders, of course, your risks there were things like selling your house, selling the thousands of houses you're building when you can't take your customer around the show house. So you've got something there which is very, very different. And you try operating a building site safely when you've got gangs of people where you have to have the buddy principle, you know, for the electrician. You can't have somebody scaffolding and roofing on their own. If you ever, you know, brickies, you've got the mortar. So it was very much a tangible, physical, hands-on, practical risk issues. Financial services, a lot of it sat around how do I operate in in accordance with regulation and be with good cyber defenses when I've gone from operating on 4 sites to operating on 3,000 sites, i.e. everybody's at home. So you've skewed over into the risks, which I would say you can't sort of grip and nail to the wall, you know, which is the ones we have with financial services, due to the very, very practical ones of the house builder. So there's just sort of some foods for thought, if that's okay, Sharon. I can go on endlessly, as you know, so I'll just stop there. All right.
Thanks, Angela. Very, very insightful. Because what I was very keen to pick up was the nuances and differences in terms of the different industries, their structure in the way they were responding to different activities, and to what extent they are rabbits in headlights in the process. Paul, did you find in your role as an advisor to many senior executives, potentially some board members, potentially some boards as well, that you were almost the, more than just the lawyer, you were sort of their mentor, their go-to, their sounding board? In what way did they turn to you as their trusted solicitor in a way that was different last year to what it was, say, the year before?
It's a really interesting question. I think that, well, 2 things. If you look at it from the law services perspective, certainly in London, legal services firms like to consider themselves as trusted friends to boards, and to do that, they need to provide more than legal services. So there is a kind of current theme among boards of large legal services outfits in the UK that actually you need to extend the services you provide to horizon scanning, to government affairs, to risk management. And I think there's a lot of sense in that, because our clients, from their perspective, are working in a highly politicized environment. I've never come across commercial regulation which is as politicized as Brexit regulation and COVID-19 regulation has been. And therefore, your clients do want to understand what are the politics behind various regulations and what can they do about it. And that means that takes a lot of people out of their comfort zone, a lot of people on boards, a lot of general counsel who are more comfortable dealing with more kind of, dare I say it, sort of 2-dimensional risks rather than the kind of 3-dimensional risks that Brexit and COVID-19 throws up. And it's in that area where, I mean, one of the examples I wanted to raise is we were advising a client which runs outdoor attraction centres around the world, who felt that they were being unfairly lumped in with the sort of hospitality sector, where a lot of their entertainment attractions were outdoors rather than indoors. And they felt that actually they weren't being allowed to open up with other kind of non-essential retail, but were being kept closed with a lot of internal hospitality sites. And it was a very interesting process working with them on what kind of strategy to adopt. And in the end, the advice they need is a kind of legal merits advice on whether the government policy can be challenged. But it's also a question of what's your political appetite here to challenge the government on it? You know that the government is straining its sinews to deal with COVID-19, but the reality is Whitehall is actually under-resourced to deal with this. And if the matter is sufficiently significant to your bottom line, then it is time actually to forget about the niceties of keeping a good relationship with government and actually to use, I mean, this is the advice that we've given clients, to use the sometimes legal measures that you have to actually force the government to reconsider policy. And I found that taking clients through the legal prism to actually the political consequences of what's happening to them and how you can challenge that, and actually giving clients confidence to stick their heads above the parapet and say to government, you're treating us unfairly, and we're going to try and stop you doing that. It's a fascinating process because you are dealing with areas that don't naturally fall within the scope of a law firm or typical legal advisors.
And also typically not what boards ever consider to be within their remit to consider, discuss, debate, and expect a positive outcome. So, because very seldom do you actually have an opportunity where something like this is presented, where you can have this debate with government. So really interesting. Thanks, Paul. That was fantastic insights there. Maddie, I just want to turn towards your current role as MD at Computershare, where you will be offering, through your department, services to company secretaries in the year ahead. Just specifically from what you've learned in financial services, going through the crisis, seeing how the different parts of the world responded to this, what are some of the key things you're going to help mentor co-secs that you're going to be working with to deal with, which will still be plenty more surprises that 2021 are going to deliver to all of us?
I think one of the key things will be communication with your board, with management. We had to do that in the past year, way more than before. I mean, you've always kind of striving to build a better channels of communication. But I think, if anything, some of the things that we did in the past year have been really valuable. Things like having a weekly note from, practical things, a weekly note from the chairman to the board on, what's going on, what's changing, what things are coming up, what do we need to think about, how do we need to prepare for the next board. I mean, in 2021, maybe it doesn't need to be weekly. Hopefully things will calm down a little bit. But I still think that increased communication really helped. And actually, I found boards, I think, will respond well to that increased communication that we've had to drive. I also, one of the things that we'd used that I would definitely recommend, because it worked well, was having steering groups or kind of working groups outside of board meetings, especially while we're still meeting virtually, just to work through specific topics, particularly strategy related, or if you're looking at your purpose and values, something that needs a real kind of detailed discussion, and just to really kind of keep things moving in between meetings and help support management to work through it. I mean, one of the biggest challenges this past year was just almost like the bottleneck that management became. It was, you know, such a tough role to be in, kind of senior management last year, because you had kind of had it from every angle. So I think the more that boards and company secretaries can be doing to kind of support that, the better, with increased communication.
Mm-hmm. Just picking up on that sort of leads my question to Angela, because we've seen a lot of organizations where, because of this degree of increased board involvement, it's how do we balance being too close to the executive, being too far away, probably beforehand, probably a bit too close now, and how do we balance that support rather than actually trying to take over the management role? So question, Angela, from your side, did you experience through any of your board environments a place of rabbits in the headlight? Oh my goodness, what am I going to be doing next? And if you could share, without obviously crossing any inappropriate boundaries of confidentiality, the kinds of things that people were struck and became the rabbit in the headlight, and how did the board work together to move to the next stage?
Well, I think the answer is we've all had rabbits in the headlights events. I don't know, well, there will be companies, no doubt, that sort of swanned comfortably along, but the majority of us have had to deal with stuff, and some of the stuff, and you're absolutely right, think, well, what on earth do we do about this one then? What the position, though, that we got to of getting the right sort of board interaction, we managed to get to it with all our boards in probably by the time we'd done the first quarter. Because if you remember, you know, as we closed down in March, we were all going to be reopening for the summer. So we just thought all we got to do is sort of hang on for 3 months and then it'll all be all right again. And of course, it dramatically wasn't. So we got the hang of that too. But we have various arrangements on all the boards which approximately operate like this. You know, there is the usual chairman to CEO long call on Friday. Well, that was always the case, but you know, that's become a really intense one now. Chairman one-to-one with NEDs, each NED separately on a fortnightly or 3-weekly basis. With our NEDs only with chairman dinners don't take place, but we do them on Zoom. So we have the interaction properly as NEDs. We have the one-to-ones. Now that sort of provides a framework. Then as the SID, I do a CEO call every so often. And I also, when we have issues which are really getting quite difficult, we cut through some of the business of the non-stop reports and paper, which Maddie, I suspect you've been absolutely, you know, been right up to here with. And we said, okay, we'll have a verbal report, CEO verbal report. And so we do that as an extra meeting, and then we have a proper discussion. And it's when there's 1 or 2 really tricky issues. And we've all used our own private contacts and networks. Because I think it was Paul said, you know, there's the politics of all this is quite difficult. If you think that the government is going to do something or identify you in a way that's going to be unhelpful, and there is, you know, there's a good case to argue, head them off at the pass, get there first. And quite often, it isn't actually right up there in the politics anyway. It's a tweak on the regulation as to which side of the line you fall. So try and head them off at the pass by giving the reason before it's baked into tablets of stone. And if it is baked in tablets of stone, it's not often that politician will stand up and say, yeah, I made a terrible mistake, saw an egg all over the place, sorry, I'm going to change. So find them a way in the detail where you can have a tweak, and that lets them keep whatever it is that they wanted to keep out there in public, but you actually get it fixed for yourself underneath. I think the politics of Brexit, though, we're all having a struggle with now. It's not just, you know, the poor old Scottish scallop industry where they get it to Dover and then it all goes off on the dock because the paperwork isn't written in black ink or whatever. but certainly on one of my boards where, for, I have to say, practical as well as tactical reasons, our major European, fully capitalized subsidiary is in Paris, we're still having issues that are really tricky. You've got a physical issue that you can't move the people that you wanted to move, but we have the UK regulators saying, we can't do this and you can do that. And you've got Paris saying, you can do this and you can't do that. So we're stuck within what is a political argument. And the politics of this is, with all humility, it's because the French are not helpful to the Brits. I mean, I'm terribly sorry for anybody who's married to French, loves them dearly. I actually have a chalet in the French Alps, but we never stopped the 100 Years' War. We just changed weapons. And we're kind of finding that a bit with Brexit.
Paul, in your space...
And we lost the 100 Years' War, I think.
I think we might take issue with that. I just think that everybody sort of damned spears or whatever it was, shields, and then we just sort of picked them up ever since. And of course we did own half of France once as well anyway, but there we go.
Paul, the challenge to you as service providers, as lawyers, to be agile to the fears, the changing constant environment that your customers have had to deal with, and yet you can't get out of the top room of your house, and you're trying to do everything from that space. How did DLA Piper deal supporting you guys to support your customers to be agile and resilient for their benefit and your own self-welfare?
Yeah, I think, we've during this second national lockdown, we've just introduced a policy of allowing parents who are homeschooling an extra 5 days leave a year, and that's newly minted and hot off the press. And that's because, of a rising concern among the partnership and all fee earners. There's actually, it's nigh on impossible to homeschool and have a full-on day as a legal advisor. So times are tough. What I've noticed, which is echoed by what Maddie and Angela has said, is focus on mental health and support for mental health issues is at an all-time high. It's a huge priority for the firm. And there are many means by which we can speak to people if we find that actually dealing with the day job as well as home life and lockdown is getting on top of us. And I think what's fantastic is in an environment like ours, where in the past, there were great sort of prefects prizes given for those who stayed in the office longest. I think that's gone. And I think that working smarter is the new mantra. And I think that we will probably all go back to being able to take 2 days out of 3 at home every week. And so the firm has bent over backwards. In a legal services firm, your assets are the human beings who are writing the emails and answering the telephones. They are such important assets. They are the ones who develop trusting relationships with your clients, and you don't want to lose them through oversight of management. And that's been, I think, high on our execs' agenda. In terms of sort of looking at it from the outside, one thing that I have really learned. I have to sort of, as doing government affairs and Brexit, I just have to be on top of developments as they come in on a daily basis. And I'm sorry, there's no magic to doing this. I could pretend that I just read The Economist any spare moment I get, and I've got The Telegraph and The Times and The Guardian open. But I cannot underestimate the value of paying for behind the wall news feeds. I pay the firm pays a princely sum for really first-class news feeds. And that keeps me about 2 steps ahead of most businesses. So I know that when a call comes in, my breakfast briefing from 2 or 3 news feeds will cover everything I need to know to talk intelligently about the issues that affect that client. And there is so much regulatory change. I mean, just look at the vaccine war that broke. And if you're advising businesses that supply vaccines, you need to understand immediately what the EU's powers are and whether actually the power lies at member state level, etc., etc. So to remain fleet of foot, you're only as good as your most recent newsfeed.
That leads on to one of the questions in the chat that's been placed. We're going to move into picking up some of the guest questions now from all of you in my window, my stained glass window on my computer. One of the things, and Paul, maybe you can sort of start the response to this, and I don't know, Angela, you might have something to add to it, is one of the things that Brexit has challenged the UK on is on the continuity of our supply chains and where we can look at alternative sourcing of product and services and where we can actually sell our products and services to. So you've got the whole supply chain aspect, but then we've got the COVID internally, or the COVID aspect that has impacted supply chains. Is there any organization that you've been working with that has really had to re-engineer and look at their supply chain in a different way now for either of those 2 reasons?
Shall I go first on that?
Yes, please, if you could, Paul.
Yes, I think, I mean, one of the biggest sort of structural consequences of Brexit on any business that has an EU integrated supply chain is that a Brexit analysis will lead to you rationalizing that supply chain if you can. And so I would say every one of the retail or manufacturing clients that we've worked for have adapted their supply chain as a consequence of Brexit. Some of those adaptations, I'm not going to say they're easier, but they are cheaper to do because you can alter the flow of goods and you can use different ports. Sometimes you can cut the UK land bridge out of your supplies and you can rely on shipping. Sometimes you can use air freight. As a general rule, if you're a manufacturer in the EU, the less you can cross the border with your goods, the better. So yes, there is a lot of reviewing and rationalization of supply chains. Where it gets hard is there are very, very few clients who've decided to build a new production plant because of Brexit, because the working capital to do that is so extensive. And there you're dealing with clients who simply have to deal with the tariffs, and now the tariffs have gone, deal with the rules of origin, which are fiendishly complicated and are tripping up. That's the number one issue for clients with physical supply chains is rules of origin. And again, you're seeing supply chains being adapted because there's a realization now that a processing that takes place in an EU member state isn't enough or is enough to give a third country import EU origin. So you're seeing a lot about adaptation of supply chains. And then on top of that, my only other point is I think COVID-19 has made a lot of multinationals think about not the wisdom, but the pragmatism of distant and complicated supply chains, because we worked for companies that had to set up through us a monitoring mechanism to monitor legislation, COVID legislation, in 27 jurisdictions, so that they knew what was going to happen to factories in 27 different jurisdictions in advance. And as Angela said, could try and head off the government at the pass to try and save their factory. And that is unmanageable. It is unmanageable. And it leads to internal thinking about how can you simplify supply chains. And I think that will happen more and more.
I had a company that I worked for quite a period of time, giving them consultancy, and they had been forced, because of the fashion, to take all their manufacturing from being a very British brand to taking their manufacturing to China and to places like that. And sort of a couple of reputationally damaging events occurring that we've seen quite a lot of companies suffer from due to Chinese manufacturing, child labor and things like that. They still continued in the Far East because that was cheaper and that's what everybody did. And quite interestingly, they've looked at it coming into the Brexit cycle, so sort of up to 2 years ago, actually starting to bring a lot of that stuff back on shore again, as a company that started as a family business a couple of 100 years ago here in the UK. So it's interesting how different companies have actually tried to adapt to that. I don't know if there's anything specific, Angela or Maddie, you want to add on the Brexit side, or whether we want to move on to the next question.
Wonder if I could just add something very quickly, if that's okay, because certainly one of the FTSE 100 house builder, of course, Brexit, we gave a lot of thought to that. And you've got two issues, actually. You've got the long supply chain and you've got just in time. So you had to address both, and you've got to be careful that you remember the just in time as well as the supply chain. And then, of course, you have not only contractors, you've got subcontractors and subcontractors. And then, and do not forget that there is such a thing as the Polish plumber and the Romanian bricklayer and all that sort of thing as well. So in effect, we did a couple of things. And the first was, in conjunction with our major suppliers, made sure that we really filled up the sheds before Brexit. So, you were full. You got everything that potentially was going to give you a delay. You made sure that you just got it, and you paid up early for it as well. So you got it on shore. And of course, that has been extremely helpful. The second thing that has also been done is on the just-in-time bit, and that was avoid the Dover-Calais crossing, because bring in containers. You can't do just-in-time by containers, but clearly you've got the time with that to be able to get through the port, so you're not stuck in a lorry queue. So that was the just-in-time bit. And but where we go from here is not clear. I think it's just been said that rebuilding some of the UK's lost manufacturing base, in my view, does need to take place, but it isn't going to take place overnight. Interestingly, we are doing it in vaccine manufacture, of course, but we have to think, what are we going to do? You even we bring in doors, we bring in, I'm just sort of, as you can say, thinking through from the house builder perspective. We bring in doors, we bring in the equipment for kitchens, we bring in bathroom stuff. And it's the last, 20, 30 years, as we have moved ourselves around as a country and as a continent into being very much global. That means that we have sourced from a whole different jurisdictions, many of them long distance. And whilst that has had the effect of exporting our inflation, creating middle classes in many of the other countries, which were really sort of dragging themselves up, there is, what do we do about British manufacturing base, which will require a broad strategy for the country. And secondly, what are we going to do about buying from China? Because I honestly do think that China bears a responsibility for COVID. Now, it doesn't mean I'm a conspiracy theorist, but it started somewhere, didn't it? And it spread somewhere pretty quickly because a few people were not allowed to put their hands up, and one got, some got sacked for it. And do we really say that we will continue to bring in and deal as much there? Or do we think that that has to also be part of a serious balancing act? Now, I won't get into world politics, but hopefully the US will play a bit better in them from now on. Okay.
I would love us to pick some of those conversations up in the more informal conversation about to start. I'd just like to ask Maddie one last question before we do the end of the formal part of this evening. Maddie, you're going to be talking to a board chairman tomorrow, and you're going to be talking about 2021 with this board chairman. What are you going to share with that individual?
I think there's so much on the list for boards at the moment. You have to really try and keep focused, I think, at the moment. I think one of the key things that's really been impacted by COVID, and I suppose the focus has been accelerated, has been ESG issues. There was a lot more, expectation from shareholders that was growing and growing, but I think that's really compounded during 2020. And I think, often in big organizations, there's an awful lot that happens across the group to cover the E, S and the G, but our board's really considering that as a whole thoroughly, rather than just certain elements of it. I think and because the expectation is just increasing, and I think boards are going to have really clear ESG strategies going forward. So that'd be the first
on that side. Yeah, I would agree with you. And as a livery company, and also with Ingenious Methods, we're going to be covering quite a few areas around the ESG, because a lot of boards are dragging their heels on this one because they've not had to deal with these more sort of ethereal, softer issues. They've got on with dealing with the bottom line. They're dealing with numbers. They're used to and familiar with making numbers balance so that they are meeting budget. But trying to do some of these other things within the profitability of an organization is a big challenge for a lot of people in leadership roles and board roles at the moment. But at this point, I don't know if there's anything the Master would like to say to close off the evening. I'm sorry, so you have gone on mute and disappeared, so I'm not quite sure if you are around. Thank you, Ted. Is there anything you would like to say goodbye before I formally close the session?
Not only am I around, I've been listening avidly. I was just trying to save the bandwidth. I actually have a question, and I'm going to use the Master's prerogative. I keep hearing people moaning about the Brexit problems with exports and imports. I started my working life in international trade before the EU slapped all sorts of laissez-faire, you can take your goods anywhere you like without documentation. We all knew our way around the tariff books. We also knew that we had to have all our documents completely correct or we would have problems. And in fact, 35 years ago, I had to fly out to Greece urgently because the company I worked for was accused of smuggling because someone had miscompleted a set of forms. Is one of the problems with Brexit the fact that people no longer know how to be exact and how to really do the guts of their job?
Paul, can we leave that in your lap to answer?
I think no. I might respectfully disagree with you, if I may. I think supply chain leads are fastidious people, as you'll probably recognise. And I think that the work that goes into ensuring you submit correct documentation is as strong as it ever was. And I also see that the one thing that everybody wants to avoid is goods getting stuck in transmission. What I think the problem is confusion over what the rules are. And there's a bit of nationalism between customs authorities and regulatory authorities on that. There's also legitimate confusion where I see it all the time where a customs authority interprets a legal provision differently in Ireland than in the Netherlands. And these are teething problems which were always going to be inevitable. You can't change from being in a customs union in a single market to being outside the single market and in outside a customs union without these snags. So I do think that obviously companies take them very seriously. I do think there's confusion. I think that the trade of freight forwarding is in much demand, and freight forwarders interpret the rules in different ways as well. So I'm afraid it's a sort of cocktail for misunderstanding and bedding down, and it will take a few months for everyone to agree on what the rules are. Put that to one side very briefly. Northern Ireland is structural. That's not teething. That is far more serious, and that is a structural problem, which is the fault of the negotiators.
It is such a shame we can't carry on over a drink, because I could probably talk to you all night about this.
Yes, me too.
And actually the other two speakers. A really brilliant evening. Thank you so much. And Sharon, thank you for arranging it.
Absolute pleasure. I would like to just take this opportunity to formally thank 3 phenomenal panelists who stood up to the occasion with their variety, their differences, their knowledge, and the eloquence by which all 3 of them were able to share their examples, their case studies. And we had no questions prepared in advance. Maddie did give me something a little bit about half an hour before we realized Maddie had an email she'd sent through, hadn't got through. So I had a couple of ideas that she had sprung through at the last minute. And sorry, Maddie, I didn't get around to covering many of them, but you managed to pull them into the content of the questions I had for you. But it was wonderful to see the ability for people to operate on their feet, respond to the floor questions in the way that we've done. And every one of the 3 panelists have given us insights into a world that most of us are in different worlds. We're not in a non-world, we're in different worlds. And both Paul, Angela and Maddie, all 3 of them, have given us insights into business challenges that are there, but the press seems to give us such a noise instead of this real stuff that we really want to understand and learn about. And I think 3 people have just been unbelievable in the last hour in sharing that with us. So thank you very, very much. Can we do this in the livery company manner? And thank everybody for what a wonderful, wonderful evening you've given us.